simply because culture gets loosened up as a concept and gets associated with all sorts of other things that perhaps it should not be identified with. Tourism, for a start, entertainment, handicrafts, God forbid. And yet, in so many countries in Southeast Asia, that's exactly how culture is presented today. Today, the state sees culture as something that can be commodified and sold, ideally to foreign tourists, but why not local tourists as well? And as a result, culture, which is such an important part of our identity, gets commodified and is then given a market value. And hence, all the prerogatives that are then thrown to the cultural community, so to speak, produce more culture because we need to sell more. We don't measure it in kilos, for heaven's sakes. We don't sell it by the minute or by the yard. So maybe we need to get a grip first on how and why this has happened. Historically, of course, the modern state has always had this peculiar relationship with culture. It has seen culture as something which is ambivalent, potentially dangerous. That already gives us a clue about what it is. One recalls, for example, Germany in the early 20th century, where the term Kulturkampf, the cultural fight, became an instrument of state policy. And if we revisit the history of Europe then, the Kulturkampf, the battle of culture, had all sorts of ideologically and even racially nasty connotations, because it was nothing less than an attempt by the state to foreground a certain identity at the expense of others, to give a stamp, if you like, to national culture, to give that nation a sense of cultural territoriality. Fast forward half a century, go to Indonesia, and let's revisit Indonesia during the time of Suharto, where practically everything was depoliticized. The resurgent forces of Islamist intellectualism then were given two very simple alternatives: depoliticize or face the firing squad. So what happened in Indonesia was an entire generation of intellectuals, campus-based organic intellectuals who chose the path of culture at stake, creating a phenomenon which by the 80s was referred to as Islam Kultural, where under the rubric of Islam Kultural, cultural Islam, all the issues that later erupted with Reformasi and the fall of Suharto were, in a process of slow development, gestation, and finally came out. Now, the latter case is interesting because it seems to suggest that culture is benign. The very term itself, Islam Kultural, which was actually furthering all sorts of very radical agendas, democratization, transparency, a consistent critique of the military state apparatus in Indonesia, a critique of dictatorship basically, was couched through culture, through the medium of culture. It was labeled culture in order to render it benign. And I think that's how states in Southeast Asia view culture. States, and I'm talking about states and statist elites, technocrats, with a certain governmentality that see culture as this thing which is benign, nice, happy, postcard worthy, YouTube video worthy, tourism worthy, but never threatening. Now, if that's how we view culture, then culture has lost its deconstructive critical edge. And I find that odd happening in the context of Asia as a whole, simply because if we look at, many of the grand works, the classical works, what we can claim to be the universal narratives that have emerged out of Asia, none of them were comforting. The Mahabharata is not a comforting tale. It's discomforting. It forces you to question some of the most basic presuppositions about self-identity and purpose. You don't leave the Mahabharata with a smile on your face. Like Arjuna, you leave really confused. And this is Krishna's message to Arjuna. Life is complicated. Grow up. Live with it. Simple as that. And I think that critical edge is what we are in danger of losing here in Malaysia as we formulate things like national cultural policies. Because what the state as an instrument seems to be telling us is, you can have your folktale dances, you can have your ethnic costume cliches. Once a year, we get you to parade in front of the nation in all your ethnic splendor, magnified. If we one day might find some lost tribe in the jungle with only 3 people, but you can be sure they will be represented on our National Day Parade, simply to add to the warna-warni, multi-culti, happy image that we are trying to cultivate and tell ourselves. I would argue that culture does not have to be a happy story any more than history should be a happy story. History doesn't make you happy. It tells you a lot about human folly and brutality and violence and cruelty. And if we expect it to lead us to a happy ending, then I think this is the wrong way to start approaching both culture and history. So on that one, I'll bounce it back to you.
No, I think the idea of things being difficult, ideas being difficult, philosophies being difficult, grappling with life, the question of the episode in the Mahabharata of Arjuna and Krishna serves perfectly well. I mean, today the Bhagavad Gita is regarded in kind of new age, packaged in all kinds of new age, modified ways, when actually it's a very brutal thing that is being said. Nobody exists in relation to each other. You exist completely on your own. So, you have no real relationship with your mother. You have no real relationship with your father. You have no real relationship with anyone really, apart from your own Atman and whatever. These are very difficult things to, the whole notion that the world is Maya and illusion. But we've commodification of culture and really life, middle class life, has created a kind of lumpen culture. I think the burden of the nation state has had a very destructive effect on culture as a process of symbiosis, as an organic phenomenon, as a phenomenon without boundaries, really. And we do know that we associate nationalism and nation states are so associated with so much pageantry. What Eric Hobsbawm had said, the pageantry of nation states. It's a very interesting time now because I think the nation state is exhausted. And so it is arriving at its logical, ludicrous conclusions. Malaysia is no exception to that. So we are having extremely, extremely ridiculous debates. And people wonder why, but I think it's a kind of historically determined as a result of this phenomenon called the nation state. Recently paying a lot of attention to Thailand, talking to Indonesia, where of course Thai identity has been imposed for so very long upon all the various groups. And we begin to see a very interesting phenomenon now with Thaksin, whether we like him or don't like him. Essentially this kind of devolution of cultural variety, diversity, has even resulted to people taking down pictures of the king up in the north. So a sense of identity empowerment and cultural empowerment coming through this political phenomenon. I think we're going to see a lot more of those kinds of aberrations and eccentricities as the nation state begins to get extremely, extremely weary and tired.
What is it that we desire? What is it that we are hoping for, yearning for, looking for in old notions of culture and in present notions of culture too?
Well, I think that desire itself is what we call culture. Because it is in that process of expressing whatever angst or anxiety or desires or aspirations that we mediated through a medium through which we call culture. That's what we call culture. There is one can write a history of, for example, Dike Barat, which we're going to witness after this. You can write a history of Dike Barat by just going to the dates and say, well, this is the first recorded instance when it happened. Or one can write a history of Dike Barat by saying that, well, actually, this is the culture of the people of Terengganu, Kelantan, and Patani, and this is how they express their hopes, dreams, aspirations, identity through a myriad of different forms of expression, literature, poetry, writing, dance, or what have you. That, in the end, with the benefit of hindsight, is what we generally refer to as culture. Culture just happens.
So is culture something that happens with the benefit of hindsight?
No, I think the benefit of hindsight, the meaning of culture. I think hindsight simply gives us an impression of solidity to a thing, which is then labeled and named. But while it's actually happening, it's not necessarily called culture. I doubt that anyone who's painting or writing or composing a poem actually thinks that she or he is, I'm producing culture now. That becomes culture with hindsight.
Can I ask you then, because earlier you made a comment about entertainment, and what we're about to witness in the Ibarat, is that a kind of entertainment?
They're not distinguishable.
Yes, which is why I want to pick up on something that Farish referred to earlier when you said, and God forbid, entertainment. But what is this relationship, God forbid, entertainment and culture and the arts?
Well, if the things we do, which in hindsight are seen as cultural, i.e. they emerge from, the collective and complex expression of the identity of a people or a society at one point, much later we look back upon this and say, this was the culture of them then, right? It can be entertaining, but it does not have to be entertaining. I think that's my gripe against the entertainment industry today, which seeks to entertain you non-stop. Whether it's in the form of pornography or movie about robots killing robots, a fridge turning into a Megatron or something, I don't know. That, I think, is where that for me is where the root of the problem is. We have come to the point where we think that culture is something that A, can be commodified, and by virtue of being able to be commodified, it can then be staged. And staged culture becomes entertainment. It's what happens when you learn at KLIA and then you have the hula hoop performance, and welcome to exotic third world. And now we're going to entertain you with our culture. That phrasing, and believe me, people actually use phrases like this. This is the scary thing. That's where the God forbid comes in. That's where I think we get into the problem. In the expression of the identity of these people in contact, it doesn't just come in the form of Ibarat. It can come in the form of something as innocuous and mundane as well. But I do not think that in all these instances, to entertain is the prerogative of the artist. Because I still think there is a distinction between an artist and an entertainer. And I think, unless we are prepared to accept, again, this idea that culture doesn't necessarily make you happy, doesn't necessarily entertain you, we are not going to get around this idea of culture having this deconstructive potential that it actually does.
Do you think modern man, we have an obsession with happiness? Is that part of the problem?
Can I come in on that? Yeah. Well, for extension of the entertainment industry is this phenomenon called the culture industry, of course, of which the entertainment industry has really come. I like that question. I mean, this obsession we have with happiness, because I don't believe in happiness, and somehow this shocks people. That I don't believe in happiness because it seems to be the quest of everybody. Until you ask them what you mean by happy, and they have absolutely no idea. And we play this out in all our cultural phenomena today. Oprah, for example, is the great deceiver. I mean, you come and you invest all your terrible guilt and whatever not in shedding a few tears for underprivileged African children for whom she has built a school. And then, reach under your seats and then all these gifts that make you very happy, and then you go home. But what do we desire in culture? I think, as we begin to get more distanced from, I don't want to use the word traditional thinking, but I will just because it's convenient now. The traditional thinking of people in Kelantan, for example. What do we desire in culture? And by that I mean, what do we desire in performance? What do we desire in wayang? What do we desire in Matyong or whatever it is? We desire spirit, basically. Yeah? Everything is in semangat. Everything is in spirit. And what we see in as passes off for culture today is devoid of all of this notion. Not only is it devoid of it, in many cultures today, it is seen as really very viscerally dangerous. Very, very viscerally dangerous.
And so in the same way, culture just was, because people needed something. But we've come to the point where if you need a road, somebody has to build it, somebody has to decide to build it. Is the same thing true of culture now, that we can no longer go back to a place where culture just is?
I think, I don't know, if I may say, I think we have a particular problem also that is especially acute. Because racial politics, I think, is also, apart from the nation state, I think racial politics is also arriving at some kind of dialectic moment. And so where the nation state has its already classifications and categories, we added here have this amazing racial staple to everything, which is really also getting extremely weary on both sides. So people are completely disillusioned with who they are racially and in religious terms, or they're holding on to it even more acutely than ever before. But the question of where do we go from here, I find very difficult to answer, but it's a preoccupation we have. But I don't think it's one we can ask without saying, how did we get here in the first place? Yeah? It's another argument that I have with my father all the time is, of course, sitting on boards to review history syllabus and all these kinds of things. Because I don't see what the point of that is if you're not actually going to be true about how you arrived here in the first place. I think history is a very good landscape upon which I think we've really found ourselves completely fettered. Because we cannot deal with how difficult our history is. We cannot deal with how difficult the state of Malacca, the fount of Kesultanan Melayu, how messy and complicated and cosmopolitan it was, because it doesn't fit into our idealization that has gotten increasingly more pure as the years have passed. So how do we move on from here when we are really in very deep brambles? I'm not sure. You need to cut the brambles. You need to
If I may respond to that and your question, I think we simply are moving on from here. It's always been happening. I'm happy, of course, that Eddin is doing his part to preserve, document things like the Kibarat and Wayang Kulit, which we all know were, for various domestic political reasons, regarded as taboo, politically dangerous, blah, 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 in certain states in this country. But having said that, you know as well that it's always been there as well. It's always been there. It's always been there. And I think despite whatever attempts the state tries to do, the state in general, I don't want to say the nature of human beings, but basically societies have shown that historically shown that these attempts to express precisely the wants and anxieties and confusion of the people who make up that society cannot be contained by the state. It simply continues. Dikir Barat has been going on and will continue to go on. It doesn't matter how many fatwas you issue against it, it's still going to go on. In the same way that we can have as many laws against sodomy in this country, it's going to go on. And I'm sure it was going on even when the first colonial act was introduced in Malaysia. I'm almost sure, I do not have video evidence, but I'm almost certain there was a lot of sodomy going on in Malaysia even then. So it just does. The tipping point comes, I think, if and when, at certain moments, for reasons that have more to do with the state and the fragility or the strength of the state at different times in its history, when the state flounders, that comes to the fore. And I think now, the nation state, which all of post-colonial Asia has inherited from the 40s, it's gone through fits and starts. The developmental crisis, the crisis of governmentality, the crisis of representation in countries, not only Malaysia, but Burma, Thailand, Indonesia, which are multi-ethnic, very complex, hybrid, moral societies, the crisis of the state representing itself and attempting to represent its people. That's hit a crisis point. And I think that's why this efflorescence of expressions of self and desire and want are coming out. And that is what we call culture. And that is what we call culture. And we will have, and again, this is actually the irony. At this precise moment, this spontaneity, and we've just been through a lot of spontaneity from '98, when I think, throughout Southeast Asia, after these Asian economic crisis, the nation state really floundered at that point. Every nation state in Southeast Asia, every state apparatus demonstrated that it did not have this hegemonic power. It could not bring the Asian miracle. It collapsed. And then you have this uprising, this efflorescence of expression of subjectivity all around us. It's rich, it's diverse. But here's the irony. 50 years from now, or even less perhaps, we look back on this rich, complex moment, like I said, with an eye of certainty to almost make it canonical, in the way that now we look back at P. Ramlee as if P. Ramlee is one of the gospel figures of Malaysian history. We return to P. Ramlee as our nostalgic anchor. Whenever some, right-wing ethno-nationalist raises a crisis in this country, we run back to P. Ramlee. Because P. Ramlee is our safe haven. And that too is equally dangerous. Because don't forget, P. Ramlee's movies were produced precisely at the time of intense ethnic and racial rivalry in this country. Don't forget, that's the context. So that's how basically culture naturally evolves. In fits and starts, in polydirectional, complex and confusing. And maybe we all ought to read the Bhagavad Gita and take Krishna's advice. Life sucks, it's complex, grow up, live with it, and just accept it. Do what you have to do. And that gets Arjuna to do what he does, or he did. And I think that's what we need to do as well. There are few enough certainties that we have around us now. But
Farish, it sounds as if you find those words rather comforting. Those words of Krishna to Arjuna.
Well, yes, because in a sense, they are words of counsel that remind us of the need to look at life without the rose-tinted glasses that levels and simplifies everything. The lesson that life is complex is, I think, something that everyone, whether it's on the individual or the collective societal level, will have to learn at one point. You'll have to accept that this is the reality. And from that confused mess, from that critical mass, things like G.K. Bharat emerged. A hybrid, complex, evolving, dynamic art that's alive. And I think likewise, a dynamic living Malaysia will emerge from that. But it has to begin by demystifying, killing the myth of Santa Claus. There is no happy ending necessarily, but life's still worth living. And I think that's the great redeeming thing about stories like the dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna, or even the story of Hang Tuah, if you want to bring it closer to our part of the world. Hang Tuah, in his travels, discovers that life is complex. And at the same time, people are all the same. He loses his particular parochial sectarian attachments to a particular specific ethnicity. He becomes the universal person. But he can only do that through the shedding process. And I think, this convolution that not only Malaysia, but all of Southeast Asia is going through at the moment is a sort of shedding of the snakeskin. And it expresses itself, unfortunately, at times, through some extremely nasty, discursive pyrotechnics, sometimes even literal pyrotechnics. But I still would not undervalue the productive potential of this mess that we're seeing now.
I think we'll go back to something that Eddin brought up earlier, which is maybe part of what creates the mess, and not in a good way, because I think that mess is necessary. Turbulence, chaos is very necessary. But perhaps the mess is being contained because of issues of race politics in this country. So Eddin, to maybe kind of talk a bit about this, what has been the effect of racialization, race politics on maybe the natural turbulence and chaos of culture?
I think because it takes a life of its own. After a while, it just feeds itself. How much more Malay can you get? How much more Indian can you get? And it's bouncing off each other. the kind of crisis of diversity, that we find in this country. It's happening with each community today. I'm amazed at how every community believes themselves to be the victim of everybody else. Every one of them is a victim of the other, and with that comes a whole kind of quest for renewal and new mythologies and so on.
Can I just interject? I think it's become so endemic now that even the Peranakan community, who are all mongrels, now claim to be pure Peranakans. I mean, that's that's the level of absurdity it has reached.
Yes, absolutely. So it's a process where you begin to embrace this. I think we have no choice, really, but to appreciate that things are incredibly complex and very, very difficult. I think it was Derek Walcott who said a very lovely phrase, I come from a country that is mongrelized and polyglot, a country without a history like heaven. Yeah.